Today we encounter teaching that is both unpopular in the modern world and embarrassing to most Christians in the West, so much so that it is scarcely practiced in churches. All kinds of ingenious interpretations are offered in order to avoid the obvious. When Christians meet together for the exercise of spiritual gifts, men should not cover their heads and women should cover their heads. Now we're going to read from 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verses 2 to 6 on this subject. Now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things and keep the ordinances as I delivered them to you. But I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man praying or prophesying having his head covered dishonoureth his head. But every woman that prayeth or prophesieth with her head uncovered dishonoureth her head. For that is even all one as if she were shaven. For if the woman be not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it be a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her be covered. I always find that the Apostle Paul is very balanced in how he addresses the Corinthians. While there was a lot of disorder in the assembly, he did recognise that they were not complete heretics. Ye keep the ordinances as I delivered them to you, he writes in verse 2. In other words, they were orthodox in most of their beliefs, even though they were deficient in many practices. However, when Paul went on to write, but I would have you know, in verse 3, I think that he was identifying one of those malpractices. Paul is dealing with a subject that we call headship, perhaps a difficult concept to understand. So let me try to explain it as the authority invested in someone by virtue of which they have certain leadership responsibilities for the well-being of others, and to which those other people in turn should be submissive. And it is necessary for any well-ordered organisation or group. In verse 3, Paul presents three elements to headship. The head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God. Now it's important to recognise that the headship of Christ comes first, and that tells me that it is principally his headship that Paul has in mind. It is his authority that must be recognised in each assembly of believers. It is his assembly after all. Now, some recent translations of this chapter have, to be frank, made a complete dog's dinner of it, sometimes translating the Greek word gune as woman and sometimes as wife. Now, the very fact that the translation wife leads to nonsensical statements later in the chapter should be sufficient for us to see that Paul is referring to males and females generally, and that he's interested in how they can exhibit the headship of Christ when we come together in the assembly gatherings. Now verses 4 to 6 tell us, as the head of every man is Christ, in verse 3, each male can display this by ensuring that his physical head is not covered. To do otherwise, having his physical head covered, would be to dishonour his authority head. Verse 4, that's Christ. That would be to deny his headship. In a complementary way, because the head of the woman is the man, verse 3, she acknowledges this by covering her physical head, but in so doing indicates that the man's headship is secondary to the headship of Christ. Now, another point that might help us in these countercultural things is this. The head of Christ is God, verse 3. The Lord Jesus Christ also has a head, and he was also submissive. While it is the headship of Christ that is primary in these verses, the submission of Christ is exemplary. If he who was on equality with God was willing to be submissive, then surely we will want to submit ourselves to the two symbols of his headship that are set out in these verses.